January 9, 1945. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. The room was quiet, not from calm, but from restraint. On Dwight Eisenhower's desk lay a single sheet of paper, already typed, already authorized in every way that mattered. It was the order relieving Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery of command. Eisenhower had read it twice. He did not need to read it again. The decision had already been made in substance, if not in ink. 2 hours earlier, Omar Bradley had stood in this same room and said that he could no longer command American soldiers under a structure that tolerated public humiliation. George Patton had been less measured. If Montgomery remained, he would request reassignment. If the request was denied, he would resign. Between them, they commanded the operational heart of the American war effort in Europe. Eisenhower understood the meaning immediately. This was not a protest. It was an ultimatum. If he protected Montgomery, he would lose his American commanders. If he removed Montgomery, he would detonate the alliance. The press conference transcript still sat open beside the dismissal order. Montgomery's words were underlined in pencil. "I handled the battle." The phrase repeated again and again, each repetition stripping authority from American command and placing it squarely on British shoulders. The damage was already done. Newspapers had moved. Parliament had reacted. Washington was asking questions. Eisenhower picked up his pen. The decision, as a military matter, was finished. Then the telephone rang. The call was from London. The voice on the line was Winston Churchill's. It was not raised. It did not threaten. It did not need to. Churchill spoke of national honor, of British morale, of a war not yet won, and an alliance that could still fracture. He spoke of consequences that would not remain confined to one general. Eisenhower set the pen down. The order remained unsigned. The decision was no longer about Montgomery. It never had been. At that moment in January 1945, the military situation in Western Europe was no longer uncertain. The German offensive in the Ardennes had failed. The front had stabilized. The initiative had returned decisively to the Allies. Whatever danger had existed in December was already receding into the past. From a purely military standpoint, Eisenhower had room to act. Montgomery no longer held a critical operational position. His temporary command over American armies during the crisis had already ended. U.S. First Army and Ninth Army were returning to American control. The Allied front was once again organized along national lines under a unified strategic plan. Removing Montgomery would not collapse an ongoing operation. No attack depended on his presence. No defensive line required his hand. The British contribution to the Western Front, while symbolically significant, was no longer decisive in scale. By early 1945, American forces made up the overwhelming majority of Allied combat power in Europe. American logistics sustained the advance. American armies held the longest sectors of the front. American commanders were directing the main thrusts into Germany. If Eisenhower chose to act, he would not be abandoning the battlefield to chaos. Nor was Montgomery uniquely irreplaceable. The British Army possessed other senior commanders capable of assuming control of 21st Army Group. The machinery of war would continue to function. Orders would still be obeyed. Fronts would still advance. From an organizational perspective, Montgomery's removal was inconvenient, not catastrophic. The precedent already existed. Eisenhower had relieved senior officers before. American generals had been removed quietly when confidence failed. Allied commanders had been reassigned when performance or conduct became unacceptable. The authority of the Supreme Allied Commander was real, not ceremonial. On paper, Montgomery answered to Eisenhower. Even Montgomery's past successes did not place him beyond professional scrutiny. His most celebrated victory lay years behind him, under different conditions, against a different enemy. Since Normandy, his record was mixed at best. Market Garden had failed completely. The subsequent months had not produced the decisive breakthroughs he had promised. None of this was secret within Allied command circles. The immediate crisis was not tactical incompetence. It was command cohesion. Montgomery's press conference had done something more dangerous than lose ground. It had undermined trust. American commanders could not explain to their officers why they were expected to accept public disparagement from a foreign superior. Soldiers who had fought and died in the Ardennes were now reading headlines that credited their survival to British intervention. From a military logic standpoint, this erosion of confidence mattered more than any single commander. Armies function on legitimacy. If that legitimacy collapses, discipline follows. Bradley understood this. Patton understood it instinctively. Eisenhower understood it as well. Removing Montgomery would have resolved the immediate military problem cleanly. It would have restored unity within American command. It would have drawn a clear line around acceptable conduct. It would have reassured U.S. forces that their sacrifices were not negotiable for political convenience. The opportunity was real. The authority existed. The operational risk was manageable. What stood in the way was not the battlefield, not logistics, not timing. It was everything that lay outside the maps. Eisenhower did not arrive at this moment unprepared. The rupture caused by Montgomery's behavior was not sudden, and the risks had been assessed long before the press conference forced them into the open. As Supreme Allied Commander, Eisenhower's authority rested less on personal dominance than on anticipation. He watched patterns. Montgomery had been a problem of pattern, not of temperament. He demanded concentration of resources, promised decisive results, failed to deliver them, and then reframed the outcome to preserve his standing. Each cycle left fewer options for those forced to work around him. Eisenhower understood this structure early. He kept detailed records of disputes, memoranda, and correspondence. He read Montgomery's private letters to London. He listened to the complaints of American commanders without endorsing them publicly. He did not confront Montgomery directly unless forced. This was not indecision. It was containment. By late 1944, Eisenhower had already limited Montgomery's freedom of action. The broad front strategy was enforced despite Montgomery's objections. Requests for priority in fuel and reinforcements were denied. American armies were kept under American command whenever possible. These were quiet controls, designed to prevent Montgomery from shaping the war to his own narrative. The Battle of the Bulge disrupted that equilibrium. Operational necessity required Eisenhower to place American forces temporarily under Montgomery's coordination in the northern sector. Eisenhower knew how this would be perceived. He accepted the risk because the military situation demanded speed, not harmony. What he did not accept was public reinterpretation. The warning signs were immediate. Eisenhower read the early drafts of Montgomery's statements with concern. He instructed that all public communication regarding the Ardennes should emphasize collective Allied effort. He expected Montgomery to comply. Montgomery did not. The press conference was not a misunderstanding. It followed a long internal struggle over credit, prestige, and authority. Montgomery spoke as he always did when unchecked, in the first person, with certainty, and with no regard for how his words would land outside Britain. Eisenhower anticipated the reaction. He knew Bradley would see the remarks as intolerable. He knew Patton would interpret them as betrayal. He knew Washington would demand explanation. He also knew that once the issue entered public space, private management would no longer suffice. Before the press conference transcripts had finished circulating, Eisenhower had already begun drafting contingency responses. One was disciplinary. One was conciliatory. One was terminal. The terminal option was the dismissal order. It was not written in anger. It was written as a final corrective. Eisenhower understood exactly what dismissing Montgomery would signal: that national prestige did not outweigh command integrity, that public insubordination had consequences, and that the alliance was held together by rules, not personalities. He also understood what it would cost. Eisenhower's preparation lay in knowing that either path would damage the war effort. The question was where the damage would fall. Removing Montgomery would stabilize American command but fracture British politics. Retaining Montgomery would preserve alliance optics while corroding trust within the operational core. Eisenhower had managed egos before. He had restrained Patton after Sicily. He had absorbed criticism from Churchill during Normandy. He had navigated Roosevelt's expectations and Stalin's suspicions. He believed he could manage Montgomery as well. if Montgomery could be forced back into discipline. The letter of apology was not a concession. It was a test. If Montgomery could not submit privately, he would be removed publicly. Eisenhower had already decided that much. What Eisenhower did not yet know was whether the political system surrounding Montgomery would allow that test to proceed. The warning was complete. The mechanisms were in place. The decision awaited only one factor Eisenhower could not command: London. The intervention came quickly, and it did not come from within the military chain of command. Winston Churchill did not wait for Eisenhower to act. He understood the danger before the Americans formalized it. Montgomery's press conference was not merely embarrassing. It threatened to expose a truth Britain could not afford to admit in January 1945, that British influence in the Allied war effort rested more on prestige than power. Churchill's priority was not Montgomery's competence. It was Britain's position. The British Army no longer dominated the Western Front numerically or materially. British industry depended on American production. British strategy depended on American manpower. What Britain still possessed was symbolic authority, earned through years of solitary war and sustained by figures the public recognized as victors. Montgomery was one of those figures. Removing him was not a personnel adjustment. It was a political statement. Churchill understood how it would be received at home. The British public did not track operational failures in the Netherlands or command friction in Belgium. They remembered El Alamein. They remembered a general who had delivered certainty after years of humiliation. To them, Montgomery was not a subordinate officer. He was proof that Britain still mattered. If Eisenhower dismissed Montgomery unilaterally, Churchill would face immediate pressure in Parliament. He would be accused of allowing American dominance to erase British sacrifice. Newspapers would frame the decision as a purge, not a correction. The war was not yet over. Churchill could not allow the appearance that Britain had surrendered command authority just months before victory. There was also the alliance structure itself. The combined chiefs of staff existed precisely to prevent unilateral action. Montgomery answered to Eisenhower operationally, but politically, he answered to London. Churchill knew that if Eisenhower acted alone, he could appeal directly to Roosevelt. The issue would move from headquarters to capitals. That escalation was the leverage. Churchill did not threaten Eisenhower directly. He did not need to. He spoke in terms of consequences. Public statements would be required. Parliamentary defense would be unavoidable. Questions would be raised about Allied unity. At the moment Germany was weakening, Churchill warned, the alliance could fracture under its own resentments. Eisenhower recognized the trap immediately. If he proceeded, Churchill would be forced to defend Montgomery publicly, even if privately disgusted by his behavior. That defense would require Churchill to criticize American sensitivity, to minimize American losses, or to reframe the Bulge in terms that favored British leadership. The dispute would become irreversible. Churchill's solution was a compromise that preserved appearances without resolving substance. Montgomery would apologize. Not publicly. Public apology would humiliate him and by extension Britain. The apology would be private, written, and unequivocal. Eisenhower would retain formal authority. Churchill would retain national dignity. The press would move on. This was not about justice. It was about containment. Eisenhower understood the political calculus. He also understood its cost. Accepting the compromise meant abandoning the only action that would have conclusively restored command credibility. It meant asking American commanders to absorb the insult for the sake of alliance stability. It meant subordinating military discipline to diplomatic necessity. Bradley and Patton were not consulted on the compromise. Eisenhower knew what their answer would be. Instead, he made the decision alone, as Supreme Allied Commander was expected to do when military logic and political reality diverged. Churchill's influence extended beyond Montgomery himself. British officers throughout the command structure took their cues from London. If Montgomery survived, it signaled that British prestige remained untouchable. If he fell, it signaled that American authority now overrode historical status. Churchill could not permit the second message to be sent while Britain still depended on American power. Eisenhower also had to consider Washington. Roosevelt's health was failing. The administration wanted the war concluded without diplomatic shockwaves. Stability mattered more than vindication. Eisenhower had been chosen for this role precisely because he could absorb resentment without retaliation. The overrule did not come in the form of an order. It came in the form of a narrowed field of action. Eisenhower could dismiss Montgomery and ignite an international crisis, or he could enforce submission quietly and preserve the coalition. The system had spoken. Montgomery was not protected because he was indispensable. He was protected because removing him would expose the imbalance at the heart of the alliance. Britain needed symbols. America needed unity. Churchill leveraged one to secure the other. Eisenhower set the dismissal order aside. The command room decision was made, not by authority, but by pressure. The consequences unfolded quietly, but they were immediate and permanent. Montgomery was summoned and informed that his position was no longer secure. Not in public terms, not through formal reprimand, but through private reality. His chief of staff made the situation unmistakably clear. Eisenhower had already prepared the dismissal order. Bradley was prepared to resign. Patton was beyond restraint. London's influence had bought time, not safety. For the first time since El Alamein, Montgomery understood that prestige would not protect him inside the Allied command structure. His rank remained intact. His authority did not. The letter he wrote was brief and restrained. It acknowledged that his remarks had caused offense. It affirmed loyalty to Eisenhower's command. It avoided explanation. It contained no defense. This was not contrition. It was compliance. Eisenhower accepted the letter. He did not respond in kind. There was no reassurance, no restoration of trust, no private reconciliation. The crisis was closed procedurally, not emotionally. Bradley read the letter and agreed to remain. His acceptance was conditional and unspoken. Montgomery would not again exercise authority over American forces. Temporary arrangements during emergencies would not be repeated. Coordination would occur through Eisenhower alone. Direct interaction would be minimized. Patton never accepted the apology. He did not need to. His role did not require accommodation. He continued his operations and spoke of Montgomery only with contempt. Eisenhower did not correct him. There was nothing left to manage. From that point forward, Montgomery's position changed in ways not recorded in orders. He retained command of British and Canadian forces, but his influence over overall strategy narrowed. Requests for resources were scrutinized more closely. His proposals received less enthusiasm. His access to Eisenhower became formal rather than familiar. The Allied command did not fracture, but it hardened. Meetings became colder. Briefings became transactional. Coordination replaced cooperation. Where trust once allowed flexibility, procedure now enforced distance. Eisenhower ensured that Montgomery could no longer shape narratives, only execute assignments. The damage extended beyond personalities. British officers observed the shift and adjusted accordingly. They understood that while Montgomery remained protected politically, his operational latitude had been reduced. The British Army would advance within its sector. Strategic direction would come from elsewhere. American commanders noticed as well. The message was unambiguous. Political realities could override accountability, but only once. The tolerance Eisenhower extended was not infinite. Montgomery had crossed the line and survived, but he had not prevailed. On the battlefield, the war continued. Armies advanced into Germany. Cities fell. Resistance collapsed. These outcomes were not shaped by Montgomery's presence or absence. They were driven by overwhelming material superiority and German exhaustion. But the command culture had changed. The Allied leadership no longer pretended that unity was organic. It was maintained deliberately, through boundaries and control. Eisenhower adjusted his approach, limiting exposure to personalities that could destabilize the coalition. He concentrated authority quietly, reducing opportunities for public friction. Churchill achieved his immediate objective. Montgomery remained a British Field Marshal until the war's end. British morale was preserved. Parliament was spared a crisis. The image of British equality within the alliance remained intact. The price was paid elsewhere. American trust in British command never recovered. The belief that shared sacrifice implied shared respect had been disproven publicly and corrected privately, but not erased. Future cooperation was cautious. Credit was carefully managed. Language was measured. Montgomery himself paid the heaviest personal cost. He retained rank without influence, visibility without authority. He was no longer consulted on matters beyond his assigned front. His voice in strategic debate faded. He continued to believe in his own judgment, but fewer people were listening. The irony was not lost on those around him. Montgomery had sought recognition and had secured survival instead. His press conference had been an attempt to cement his legacy. It had nearly ended his career. Eisenhower emerged outwardly unscathed. The alliance held. The war concluded. History would record him as a unifier, a manager of egos, a commander who kept disparate forces moving in the same direction. Internally, the cost was heavier. He had sacrificed the principle that public insubordination demanded public consequence. He had accepted that political symbolism outweighed military accountability. He had asked his American commanders to endure humiliation for the sake of coalition stability. They did so because the war demanded it. After January 1945, there were no further incidents of that magnitude. Montgomery did not repeat the behavior. He did not need to. The warning had been delivered, the boundary enforced. The system had corrected itself, but only after revealing its fragility. The decision not to fire Montgomery preserved the alliance. It also confirmed that power within it was unevenly constrained. The consequences were not written in casualty lists or captured territory. They were written in silence, distance, and the quiet reordering of authority inside headquarters rooms that never appeared on maps. By the time Germany surrendered, Montgomery was still standing. He was also alone. After the war, the record hardened. Memoirs, correspondence, and declassified cables removed the ambiguity that had surrounded the January crisis. What appeared at the time as a moment of reconciliation was, in retrospect, a controlled failure of accountability. Eisenhower never denied that he had intended to dismiss Montgomery. In private conversations and later interviews, he acknowledged that the order had been prepared and that it reflected his genuine assessment at the time. He did not describe the decision as impulsive or emotional. He described it as necessary, and then described why it could not be executed. British records confirmed Churchill's intervention. The Prime Minister's concern was never framed in terms of Montgomery's operational value. It was framed in terms of perception. British cabinet discussions treated Montgomery as a political asset whose removal by an American commander would be unacceptable regardless of merit. The preservation of national dignity outweighed disciplinary precedent. Montgomery's own post-war writings were revealing in their omissions. He never fully recanted the substance of his press conference. He acknowledged that his wording had been unfortunate, but he continued to argue that his role in stabilizing the Northern Front justified strong language. The letter of apology was described as a misunderstanding resolved by goodwill. The near dismissal did not appear in his accounts as a moment of failure, but as an example of Allied tension exaggerated by emotion. American memoirs told a different story. Bradley described the episode as the closest the Western alliance came to internal collapse after Normandy. He recorded his willingness to resign as absolute and final. He did not regret the decision, only the necessity. Patton's diaries were less restrained. He viewed Montgomery's survival as proof that political protection distorted command responsibility. Eisenhower's restraint was acknowledged, but not admired. Eisenhower himself never presented the episode as a victory. In later years, he spoke of it as one of the most difficult moments of his command, precisely because there was no correct outcome. He had preserved the alliance, but at the cost of clarity. He had enforced unity, but not justice. He had maintained control by accepting a visible exception to it. The institutional lesson was absorbed quietly. After January 1945, Eisenhower centralized public communication even more tightly. Press access was controlled. Statements were vetted. Credit was distributed cautiously. No commander was again allowed to define events independently. The system adapted to prevent repetition. Montgomery's post-war career reflected the unresolved nature of the incident. He remained prominent, decorated, and publicly celebrated in Britain. Internationally, confirmed trust never returned. His influence in NATO years later was limited. His reputation outside Britain became increasingly contested, defined as much by his conflicts as by his victories. Churchill, writing after the war, never addressed the episode directly. He did not need to. His objective had been achieved. Britain emerged from the war recognized as a principal ally, not a subordinate. Montgomery's survival had served its purpose. From the distance of time, the January 1945 decision reads less like a personal drama and more like a structural exposure. Supreme command existed, but it was bounded. Authority was real, but conditional. Military hierarchy functioned only as long as it did not collide with national myth. The documents leave no doubt that Eisenhower understood this fully. He did not misjudge Montgomery. He did not misunderstand the insult. He did not lack the will to act. He lacked permission. The war ended before the consequences of that compromise could compound. Germany collapsed. Victory followed. The alliance dissolved into peacetime structures before the fault line reopened. History closed the case quietly. Montgomery remained in command until the end. Eisenhower carried the decision with him long after. The case closed not with a signature, but with an omission. Dwight Eisenhower did not keep Bernard Montgomery because he believed in him. He kept him because removing him would have broken something larger than a command structure. The alliance was not held together by trust. It was held together by necessity, symbolism, and restraint. Montgomery had crossed a line that, in any national army, would have ended a career. He publicly claimed credit for victories paid for in American blood. He undermined the authority of his superior. He destabilized command cohesion at the height of the war. By every professional standard, dismissal was justified. Eisenhower knew this. He acted on it. The order existed. What stopped it was not doubt, but consequence. Firing Montgomery would have forced Britain to confront its reduced role in the war while victory was still unfinished. It would have compelled Churchill to defend national prestige over military discipline. It would have shifted the conflict from headquarters to parliaments and newspapers. Eisenhower was not appointed to win arguments. He was appointed to finish the war. So he absorbed the insult. He accepted a private apology instead of a public reckoning. He preserved the appearance of equality inside an alliance that was no longer equal in power. He chose cohesion over correction. Montgomery survived, but diminished. His authority narrowed. His influence faded. His legacy hardened into controversy rather than triumph. He remained visible, but no longer central. Eisenhower prevailed, but not without cost. He learned and demonstrated that supreme command in coalition war is constrained not by rank, but by politics. Authority exists, but it is conditional. Justice is possible, but not always affordable. The decision was effective. The alliance held. Germany fell. The war ended. That is the verdict. If you want more investigations into the command room decisions that shaped the war and the blood they cost, leave a comment and subscribe.